Okay, so we're back. Other reasons for colonization would have been unemployment, um, adventure, markets for for their manufactured goods because the manufacturers in England needed to sell their stuff, and religious freedom. So there were all sorts of motives, and really there were as many motives as there were different people who showed up in the Americas. It's hard to say. These are, God, gold, and glory are always the generic reasons, but there are many. Joint stock companies, or like modern day corporations, they were the precursors to modern day corporations. And what they did is joint stock companies, it was very expensive to colonize because you had to provide the passage and you had to provide supplies for up to a year for any group that was going. And so it was very expensive. Well, governments didn't have money for that. So these joint stock companies were private investors who got together, and there might be 15 people, and they would put all their money together and they would sponsor a group of colonists who wanted to go. That was how the Virginia Company got going. The Virginia colony was sponsored by the Virginia Company. And so that's how that got started. And then that way also, the people who were investing money, they had different motives too. They were not really looking to get rich. It was not going to be a get rich quick scheme because these colonies might not show a profit for years, and so, if ever. And so they were risking their money as a business venture and hoping to get their money back. But then the companies did not intend to be around forever. They intended to be there until they were paid back, and then they would dissolve themselves. So they were not intending, this was not meant to be, a hundreds of years old company by any means. So as I said, you had all of these different ones: Virginia Company, Massachusetts Bay Company, Dutch West Indies, East Indies Company. And this is really the only image that you can come up with for joint stock company. But these are Dutch guys. And because the Dutch they were never about colonization. They were all about investment. And really the only Dutch colony was on Manhattan Island, which is now New York. And that's why it's the World Financial Center, the World Trade Center and all is here. Is because that was their purpose. So New York got its start really early as a business venture, and that's why the Dutch, they bought it from the Manhattan Indians, and then they sold it. They basically lost it, but they bought it for almost no money. The Native Americans got taken on that one, as they all did in all land deals with the Europeans. So, who were the settlers? They were entrepreneurs, they were religious minorities, they were aristocrats. They were there they provided economic resources, they provided labor, not themselves, they provided the laborers, not the rich didn't work. And they changed societies around the Atlantic world, and the Atlantic world means everything that surrounds the Atlantic Ocean, so Europe, Africa, and the Americas. So the balance of power shifts from Spain and Portugal to Northwest Europe at this point. Instead of it being all about Spain and Portugal, it's about England, France, and then the Dutch. Jamestown was issued a charter by King James I, hence the name Jamestown. They were looking for gold and passage to the Indies. They all wanted to get to the Indies faster because the land route was across the desert in Asia, or they had to go around the tip of Africa and then back up into the Indian Ocean. So it took a long time. And so that made all the spices and all the silks and the things that they wanted in Europe, it made them all very expensive because the goods had to go through a number of middlemen, and every time the middlemen handled the goods, the prices went up. So they wanted a quick passage, and they wanted a water route. So the thing is about Columbus, he underestimated the distance across the Atlantic Ocean, and he totally underestimated the fact that there was the Pacific Ocean and the Americas between him and the Orient. Totally missed that one. So while they did know that the world was round, they knew the world was not flat, but he was unaware of. He always thought, even when he died, he thought he had reached the Indies, and really he reached the Caribbean. So these people, the colonists were under great pressure to find a crop that they could sell really quick, because people at home, their investors, wanted to make a profit. And so they, if you didn't find gold or something really valuable, then, they were going to pull the support, and you'd be left over here, and, you didn't want to be left over here by yourself by any means. You needed resupply. You needed, eventually you would need defense. So the charter, this is an image of the charter of the Virginia Company, and it guarantees overseas settlers the same rights as the Englishmen at home. And why is that important? Because this will be an issue when it comes time for the American Revolution, because these guys in the Revolution say, oh, wait, whoa, if we have a right to be represented in Parliament, just like we were granted in this charter, that we had the same rights as Englishmen who were living at home. And so what happens is Virginia becomes a precedent. It sets a precedent that you get all the rights at home, and you ended up getting a representative assembly and the Virginia House of Burgesses. And so then after this, all the other colonies use them as the model in Virginia, and so they want their own representative assembly, and they want their own all the rights that they're guaranteed at home. So Jamestown, you had Captain John Smith, and then you have the Pocahontas thing, and then you had the starving time of 1610. Well, they decided to settle up the James River, and the water was brackish, meaning it didn't flow. It was dirty. It had mosquitoes. It had diseases. They had dead animals from upstream who died in the water, and it was dirty water. So disease was a huge issue. Also, lack of food was a huge issue. And they were basically prisoners in Jamestown, because the Powhatans were never really pleased that they were here. And so they had a war in 1622, and then they had a major war in 1642, and that was the end of the Powhatan Indians. But the massacre in 1622 was a major hit, because about 300 colonists were killed in that war. So they always had, the Powhatan Indians were never really glad they were here. So they were they were under threat all the time. So for them, farming outside the walls of the Palisades was not really an option. Hunting was a risk, because you risked that you're going to be killed by Indians. And they did have periods of peace, but it was never not a really good relationship. John Rolfe, this is John Rolfe. He's basically the father of the tobacco industry. Spain had a monopoly on tobacco seeds. They were the only ones that they didn't want anybody else to have them, because that was their wealth. It was good for their money. So he was able to secure tobacco seeds. We don't know how. Nobody knows even to this day how he got hold of them. Tobacco is labor intensive. You have to pull these really ugly worms off of them. They have them at Mount Vernon, and I've seen them, and they're disgusting. So the worms can have to be pulled off. You have to touch every leaf on every plant at least once a week. Very labor intensive. Requires a lot of land. And it also takes out all of the nutrients in the soil really quick. So it's very hard to grow tobacco. And part of the problem with the South is that they were not keen on diversification. So they were chained to this for probably 100 years, where all they grew was tobacco. You need to diversify, because you need to do crop rotation and those kinds of things. They knew base crop rotation, but they didn't know everything. So you had the first Powhatan War in 1622 and the second Powhatan War in 1644, and the Indians were victims of disease, disorganization and disposability. So if you weren't needed by the English, then you were just, they'd rather you be gone. They'd rather you be out of the picture. They were disorganized. Native Americans never got it together enough. Had they stood up as a group, like all Native Americans, regardless of tribe, had they stood up as a group earlier, they would likely have taken these colonies out because the colonies were so weak because of the disease, the lack of food, just the stability was an issue. But all these Native Americans, they never saw the big picture, and they never could have predicted what was going to happen, the fact that the English were going to take over these colonies. So what they did is they played the English and then later the French and off each other, trying to get a better deal tribe to tribe. So if they thought that the British would help them out against another tribe, then they would side with the British. And then if they thought that that another group would side with the French, then the French and this other group of Indians would be together. And so they played each other's. They used all these old grudges and this old revenge when they should have gotten together and said, "Look, we got to fight these people off, send them back home." But they never did that. They were busy playing favorites and, trying to manipulate other tribes. So they waited too late to try to figure this out, and by then the English were too numerous for them to actually fight off. So they were used to change, and they were used to having to adapt, and they were used to natural disasters and things, but the population was decimated by disease. Up to 90% of the Native Americans were gone within the first 150 years after contact. And then they had this forced migration where they were continuously run out of whatever land they had before. This is called the middle ground. And this is the Great Lakes, of course. And this is where they all came together. And so you had the Native Americans from this part of the country and then from the east. And these groups all were fighting against each other too. So you had a lot of instability amongst the Native Americans too. So how did the English Empire expand by 1650? The English subscribed to an economic system called mercantilism. And what that meant was that the government should, according to this theory, government should regulate economic activity so that the more the gold, they wanted more gold and silver flowing into their country than out. And so they wanted to export goods, but they really didn't want to import. And so the colonies allowed them to have a market for their goods. They could sell the goods to the colonists, and then the colonists were sending all of the natural resources here. The Brits never wanted the colonists to produce anything because that would have hurt the merchants at home. So they discouraged heavily any kind of manufacturing going on here. They just wanted them to export things like beaver pelts, deer skins, lumber, the big spars, the virgin forest. They wanted those spars for masts for their ships because they were always at war and the ships were getting blown up. So they had depleted the forest in England. The virgin forest in England had been gone for ages. And so they found all these. So you had shipbuilding and lumbering in New England where the forests were thick, really thick. And then you had tobacco, which was another great big moneymaker. And then you had, in the South, you would eventually have rice and indigo. And that cotton is not even on the radar till about 1793. We'll talk about that later. So that's where you stand with, they wanted to keep all their money. You had to ship everything on British ships. You had to ship everything with British crews. You could not, they didn't want the colonists to trade in the Caribbean. So the colonists set up a smuggling trade at that point because they said, well, the king's not going to be able to do anything about it. So we're going to do it. We're going to trade with these people in the Caribbean because we can get more money. So we'll stop there for just a second.